We will start again with a presentation by Myroslav Shkandrij. You have 12 minutes.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to speak about a very controversial book, which you probably already have heard about, know about, and a very controversial author, scholar, Volodymyr Viatrovych. This book appeared, the second edition appeared in 2012. It was a heavily revised, changed edition. There was a big discussion in Ab Imperio, not a very, to my mind, not a very satisfying discussion that took place at that time, 2012. And as you're probably aware, the Polish Parliament this year, on the 22nd of July, passed a resolution stating that the events in Volhynia in 1943 were a genocide. Immediately afterwards, 90 prominent Ukrainian intellectuals and authors suggested that the government of Ukraine should institute a 3 days of recognition of the individuals who suffered repression under Poland. So this is a discussion that is heavily in play right now. Viatrovych, if you don't already know, is a central figure in the memory wars. He became this kind of figure who glorified UPA OUN right from the beginning of his appointment to the Institute for the Study of the Liberation Movement in 2002, became a director of that institute in 2006, head of the secret police archives in Ukraine in 2008, and he has since then carried on a campaign, famously stating in 2010 that without the UPA, without Bandera, without Shukhevych, there would be no national liberation. So this is the book. It is now going to be translated. It has been translated almost immediately into Polish. There is a Polish version now. It is being translated into English, and he's working on follow-up books and collections of documents. The book is interesting in that it uses the archives of the secret police, the Mykola Lebedь archive, which is partially in Kiev and partially in Harvard, but he also used the Kubiovich archive here in the Library and Archives of Canada. It's also important, and I'm sure we'll hear more from the next speaker, because it introduces the events in Chelm, or Cholm in Ukrainian, and Zakherzonia, the territory west of the Curzon line. It has been heavily criticized, however. The book has been criticized on numerous fronts. One of them is that Viatrovych had privileged access to archives. He only used certain things. Another argument is that he has heavily politicized this discussion. And it's not just Western scholars or scholars in Ukraine, prominent scholars in Ukraine. It's also all sorts of people have criticized this, including prominent journalists like Vitaly Portnikov, Yuri Vinnichuk, Taras Wozniak. Well, what's the main argument? The main argument is that there was a long war. You cannot look at what the events of Volhynia without the wider bookends. There was a war that you can go back to 1918, 1919, the Ukrainian-Polish War. You can go back to the events in Chelm, which preceded the Second World War and preceded the killings that took place in 1943 in Volhynia. And you can go afterwards to Akcja Wisła and the expulsion of Ukrainians, 150,000 from the traditional lands in southeastern Poland. So that's his main argument. And yet it has not convinced scholars. It's also part of memory wars, cultural memory wars. If you know Oksana Zabushko's book, this is all about the UPA, and it's a kind of a glorification, an editing process that is going on in Ukrainian cultural studies. There are two completely different visions. One of them, as these slides show, is a vision. This was a 1939 postcard that was produced during the battle for Carpatho, Ukraine. a heroization of what was going on there. And this is a sort of a leaflet that a friend of mine picked up in Poland that is being distributed now. So you've got heroes and killers, villains. What are the arguments? Well, I'm going to break them down for you, but essentially they are equivalence, national conflation of the Ukrainian national liberation struggle with the OUN, lack of discussion of the Holocaust, the decision to take ethnic cleansing by the OUN, victimhood but no recognition of Ukrainian guilt, and so on. I'm going to take them one at a time, and I'm going to show you some images from mainly published in emigration, Ukrainian immigration, Ukrainian diaspora, which show how the process of heroization or glorification of the OUN and UPA has grown. This book by an author, by one of the underground artists, is very popular, often reproduced. The argument is that it was really a war. And in a war, you have two sides roughly equivalent. The suffering, the sacrifices are roughly equivalent. Now, the Poles and most of the prominent Ukrainian writers do not buy this. They do not feel, as Viatrovych does, that there was a rough equivalence, that in fact this was ethnic cleansing. And there's no excuse for it, as several prominent Ukrainian writers have said. Secondly, the problem of national liberation struggle. Viatrovych's book, from beginning to end, does not make any distinction between two terms, national liberation struggle and the OUN-B. Not even the OUN. He talks about the OUN-B, the Banderites, the Banderite party, as being synonymous with national liberation. This is extremely problematic. It was a minority party even in Galicia in the 1930s. It was violently opposed in immigration by the majority of emigres. The book, Viatrovych's book, has no discussion of ideology whatsoever, and he doesn't talk about any of the other OUNs that existed, the OUN-M, the OUN-Z. He doesn't talk about the tensions between these organizations. In fact, I discovered that he really follows the line of Mykola Lebed's book, published in 1944, called UPA. This seems to have been a book that he discovered and a book around which he based his argumentation. And I have to say also that he plays fast and loose with some facts. I'll just give you one. 1940, he says that the party, their own the Banderites, published a program in which they said, with the Poles, with the peoples of the USSR, against Hitler and Stalin. Well, in fact, that was Mitringa's slogan. That slogan was voted down by the OUN-B. It never became part of the OUN-B program. There's no discussion of the Holodomor, of the Holocaust at all. As we know, Timothy Schneider and others have spoken about the fact that the soldiers from the people who became soldiers in the UPA were actually trained policemen who were told to desert and go into the underground in March 1943, which Viatrovych agrees with, but he does not talk about any of the techniques that they may have learned from participating in the Holocaust or witnessing the Holocaust. There's no discussion of anti-Semitism, even though we know, and it's very easy to check, between 1937 and 1941 there was an increase in anti-Semitic propaganda published by the OUN-B in particular. There's no discussion of the unleashing of the ethnic cleansing that took place. Even though at points, Viatrovych does come very close to saying that the OUN-UPA did this. What he says is that this character, this man, Dmytro Klyachkivsky, who was head of the northeastern UPA, on his own unleashed the ethnic cleansing. So the argument that he uses is that it wasn't the central authority in UPA, it wasn't the OUN-UPA who did this, it was local authorities, local UPA. Well, there is no smoking gun, there is no document, but Hrycak, Yaroslav Hrycak, the historian, Ihor Ilyushin and various others have said you don't need a smoking gun. It's quite clear that verbal instructions could have been given and no doubt were. The next thing that I want to point out is this business of victimhood, but no discussion of guilt. The Ukrainians are portrayed as victims, which in many ways they were, but the actions in Volhynia in 1943 are portrayed as a jacquerie, a peasant rebellion, a cruel, nasty war that was out of control. This sort of is supposed to exonerate the party and the UPA leadership. Ethnic cleansing and genocide. He is opposed to the saying that it was a genocide, but he comes awfully close. And this is one of the things that is not picked up in the arguments, the discussions about Viatrovych. He comes awfully close to saying that it was ethnic cleansing. He says at one point, and he quotes an order saying that if they don't leave, we will kill the males, kill all the males. And then he says, well, it wasn't ethnic cleansing, it was simply they refused to leave. It was pressure on them to leave. The atrocities, if the atrocities do take place, and he admits they did take place, are always blamed on renegade commanders. And then at one point he comes awfully close to saying that ethnic cleansing had to take place. He quotes Graziosi and Gellner and other historians as saying, yeah, this, they agree with this. It had to happen. Well, my main interest is in cultural memory, and I think to understand how this is being shaped, you have to also look at how over the last 70 years, particularly in emigration, this whole vision of the UPA and the whole image of the UPA and OUN-UPA has been shaped. And I mean, you can look at Christmas cards, Easter cards, you can look at artwork, the kind of images that portray the good soldier. So this is from '48, and it was put out by the press bureau of the Western representation of the UPA. It shows the kinds of imagery that make this into a sort of a holy war, a defensive war. You can see how this imagery developed. Edward Kozak, a very famous artist, has portrayed this. I think the book is interesting, but it's a missed opportunity to explore, in fact, the fusion, the fact that many of the people involved in these territories were both victims and perpetrators. We know from the German discussion, or the discussions that have gone on in Germany about the Second World War, this whole issue of shades of guilt. We know from studies of cultural memory that cultural memory can be multi-directional. It can go in different directions. It can get tied up with various discussions about identity. We know about similar discussions in Germany about the psychology of people who get involved in mass killings. These complexities are sort of hinted at in the book, but they're not pursued. And I think my conclusion is that he moves in that direction of understanding and trying to point out the complexities, but his polemical intent and his defensive posture makes him pull back at various points. And that's because this book really, in fact, is a kind of a justification, a modern, contemporary justification and an apology for the OUN, the Banderite movement and the Banderite party. And I think this is what he's doing. This is why the book has been produced. This is why it is very strongly supported by various elements in the emigration, in the diaspora. So it's a kind of a conjurer's trick, as I call it in the paper, where you avoid talking about many of the complexities, and all that emerges is one party, one leader, one organization, and they become they are assimilated into this idea of one national liberation struggle. So I think this is extremely problematic, although the book has a lot of interesting things to say, particularly about a lot of information about what happened in Holm and Zakarzonia. He had an entire new chapter to the second edition, which is based on mainly on the materials in the Kubiovich archive here in Ottawa, which bring into focus the suffering of those people and the suffering in the post-war era of the resistance of those people to the expulsion by the Polish state. But I'm sure we'll hear a lot more about that with the next speaker.